Good afternoon, everyone. People straggling back from lunch, so if you can settle in and promptly fall asleep.
Sorry, I'm going to do this again.
That's how it works. Your body digests your food and you take a break. So, my job is to try and keep you awake for the important speakers coming after me. As John said, I'm a former journalist, now a professor in a journalism school, so not surprisingly I'm here to talk to you about the relationship of media and war. Before I do that, I want to just take a brief moment to just get a sense of how you all feel about a particular group that's been under assault recently, kind of almost demonized in lots of places, and that's teachers. How do you all feel about teachers? We're pro-teacher here, is that what I'm doing? Yeah. All right. How do y'all feel about journalists? That ends the audience participation. Shut up and sit down and relax. Never ask questions to a group like this. I asked that to make a point that I hope to develop in this talk as a way to think through this question of journalism. I'm actually going to step back and talk not specifically even about the relationship of contemporary American news media to war, but to think more generally in ways that I hope will help us understand that relationship. The point I want to make about teachers and journalists is both groups are actually under assault and demonized. The reaction to my question about teachers was uniformly positive, and the reaction to my question about journalists was somewhat more mixed. And I want to ask why that is. As I said, both of these groups of professionals have been demonized and under assault in the dominant culture these days. And I think it's useful in comparing them. Let's stop and think actually about the teachers we've had. I spent my whole life in the public school system, and while I think teachers, a group of people, should be supported, there's a few I wouldn't mind taking out behind the barn and putting a bullet in their head, including the sadistic gym teacher who tortured me through junior high school, the idiot football coach who tried to teach me geometry, but I don't think he'd ever figured out basic mathematics, the alcoholic social studies teacher who never really... Okay, my point is simple. There's a lot of bad teachers. I went to a normal public school. Now, the point is, if you actually think about the teachers you have throughout school, there were a whole lot of duds, a whole lot of burned out, bad, maybe never very good teachers in the first place. So, our support for teachers isn't dependent on the fact that every teacher was wonderful and perfect. We can also reflect on the fact that there were, when we use this word teacher, it describes a large number of people, everything from folks, we had in first grade, the frontline teachers. If we use the term expansively, we would also think about the administrators, the principals, the superintendents, and if you really wanted to use it expansively, up to and including university professors such as myself. And if you think about teacher in that broader sense, then a lot of those groups I don't really have a very positive or warm feeling for. So teacher, we have this sort of celebration of teachers, but two things are true. Not all the teachers we've had were particularly good role models, and some of the people in this category of teachers actually do jobs that we are constantly in tension with. And I want to say the same thing about journalists. That if you actually look at journalists, two things. It's a mix of the competent, the incompetent, the hardworking, and the lazy. And that journalist, this expansive category, includes the kind of journalist I was, working at a daily newspaper, weekly newspapers as well. Working basically 12 to 16-hour days for something around minimum wage. All the way up to the news managers who make the decisions about what goes in, as well as the high-profile, especially on television, anchors, the Wolf Blitzers of the world. And we don't have the same reaction to all of them. Just like I have a lot of fondness for the frontline teachers, I have a lot of fondness for frontline journalists. I don't have much in common with school superintendents or news managers, and I have nothing in common with Wolf Blitzer. So the reason I want to make this point is to get us to think a little, in somewhat, I think, more complex ways about journalism. Precisely because it is a category that's demonized in contemporary culture for all sorts of reasons. And what I want to suggest we need to do is figure out why we don't like journalism. And I want to make it clear, there's a lot about journalism I don't like either. So I started with this comparison of individual teachers and individual journalists, but we don't want to stop there, because most of us would recognize that the problem really isn't in the people. If we're going to think clearly about the nature of the problem, whether it's the problem of education or the problem of journalism, the problem is in the nature of the system. And that's where I think we need to really begin the examination. The problem really isn't with teachers or journalists, it's with public education and journalism. Now, if you think about the public education system, if I were to poll you on what you think about the current state of the public education system, you probably have a litany of complaints. Right? The most obvious one for me is the mania for standardized testing, which has undermined the ability of good teachers to really do their job because they're forced into this system of teaching to test lest they lose their job. There's lots of other critiques we could make of the public education system. For instance, the way it's kind of routinized training into boredom and monotony. It's the perfect educational system if you want to create dull workers who have no capacity for critical self-reflection and will accept an authoritarian hierarchical corporate capital. Yeah, there's lots of things one could say about public education, and I think, just looking at the nodding heads, most of us would say something like that. So we want to look at the system, and we can, of course, look at the system of journalism and come up with a similar critique. And what I want to do then, very quickly, is summarize the nature of that critique of the system, talk about one particular element of that critique as a way to connect them to our concerns about the role of news media power. So I guess what I'm going to argue here is that we should celebrate journalists and condemn journalism. That we should celebrate the people who work in journalism, not every single one of them, but the people who are motivated to go into journalism by a concern for the public welfare, for democracy, for the role, potentially important role of journalism in a truly democratic culture. And make no mistake, most of the journalists who go into the field are motivated by that. I teach an introductory journalism course at the University of Texas, 200 to 300 students. And that's a big group with lots of variation. But the students in those classes who are really going to go into journalism, who are serious about the profession, almost to a person are motivated by a concern for public welfare and a real commitment to the role of journalism in creating a more democratic culture. They come in with those ideals, just like most teachers come into the system with an ideal about educating and deepening the experience of students. So in praise of journalists doesn't mean that we close our eyes to the failures of individual journalists, but to recognize that most journalists do come in with that spirit. And to condemn journalism is to critique the system in which they work. Now, there's been lots of such critique, some of it coming out of academic arenas, some of it out of more politicized, popular spaces. But I've been paying attention to that critique of the institution of journalism for the past 25 years or so. And when I looked at all of that work to try and help us understand the problem of journalism, I think it comes down to really three things. I'm prone to lists of three, as we'll find out throughout this talk. I think it's my rooting in a Christian tradition. Everything has to be threes. So I got a couple of lists of threes. Makes it easy to take notes. So what's the problem of journalism? What's the problem of the way in which journalism is developed, especially in the 20th century, especially in the second half of the 20th century, that leads to some of the frustrations that I know we all share about the performance of those individual journalists. The three things I think we have to pay attention to are institutional structures, professional work routines, and ideological frameworks. That's what I want to talk about. But if you want to understand the problem of journalism in these professional journalistic settings, you look at institutions, at professional work routines, and at ideology. So I'll do these really quickly because some of this is probably familiar to those of you who've been reading and thinking about this. The obvious point about institutions: journalists don't work on their own. They don't get up in the morning and go out and search for truth. They go out in the morning and, like most of us, go to the office. And for most journalists in this culture, that office is within a corporate commercial framework. And those are the two key points. The institutional realities of journalism are corporate and commercial. Corporate meaning that most journalism in this country that exists in what we're going to call the mainstream, the journalism that we care about so much, because it's the journalism where most of the American public gets most of its information. For all, and we'll talk more about the changes in the industry, the explosion of alternative media sources, but for the most part, that mainstream news media, which means the broadcast and cable television stations, the major daily newspapers, to some degree still news weekly, news magazines, those are the places where most people get most of their information. I always think of my mother, who gets about 98% of her information about the world from CNN, as far as I can tell. And I don't think she's an anomaly. Television news is the place she gets most of what she knows about the world. All right, so this mainstream media goes forward in a corporate and commercial setting. Corporate, it is organized in typical corporate form, hierarchical, all power concentrated at the top, and as most of you know, the number of corporations involved in the news media has been shrinking as corporate consolidation has gone forward over the last, especially the last 30 years or so. So journalists are working in these hierarchical, authoritarian kinds of settings, and of course it's a commercial enterprise, it's a for-profit enterprise, and everyone also knows the major revenue streams for media are advertising. And so the reality of working in that setting is the first of the factors that shape contemporary journalism. The second are the professional work routines of journalism itself. That, and this is one place we want to spend a fair amount of time thinking. Journalism has meant many things in the history of the modern world, but in the contemporary period in the United States, to be a professional journalist is to follow a set of work routines that generally come under the heading of this term objectivity. And we can, in the discussion period, you want to talk more about objectivity. It's an interesting concept because it's a concept we both endorse. Being objective is a good thing. Right? Stepping back, trying to understand the nature of the world without preconceived notions, committing to an honest intellectual process. If that's what objectivity means, that's a good thing. Journalists should be objective. So should you. John, you should be objective. Yes? Yes. Clean up that thinking of yours a little bit. Get tighter, you know? Keep the preconceived notions out. Evidence-based, logical. But of course, that's not what objectivity means in practice in newsrooms. Objectivity is a set of work routines that revolve mostly around who is and who is not an authoritative source. Who is a person capable of knowing things. And in journalism, not all potential sources are the same. We know quite clearly that, especially in the context of our discussions about war, sources that come out of authorized institutions like the government, the Pentagon, State Department, the White House, those are the credible sources to journalists. And so that's all built into the work routines of contemporary. It has nothing to do with an individual journalist any more than the corporate commercial nature of the institution they work in is their choice. They're working in very well-defined professional routines. The third factor that shapes contemporary news is the ideological framework within which journalists work. And the thing I always say about journalism, the most important thing to know about American journalists is that they are Americans. That is to say, they are educated and socialized in this culture. And except for people who, for reasons that can be complex, we all have our own stories, except for people who kind of self-consciously break with that ideology. In other words, the freaks. In other words, Look around. No offense, but it's all what it is. Room full of freaks. I don't exempt myself from that. No, but unless you find yourself on that other path, you're born, raised, educated, socialized in a culture, and that ideological framework defines you. And journalism is no different. And here again, I want to come back around to teaching. Remember that teaching is no different either. We celebrate teachers, but all of us can probably reflect on the teachers we had and how many of them were willing to step out of that ideological framework and critique sharply. Anybody ever had high school economics? I did. It was taught basically out of the Wall Street Journal, as far as I can tell. High school history. In other words, this ideology is a very crucial part of this, because even people we admire, even people who work hard, even people we want to support can be trapped in it. And journalists are no different. Nor are university professors, as a footnote. The degree of ideological conformity at my own university is quite striking, actually. So, the institutional structure, the corporate commercial nature, driven by advertising revenues, the professional work routines, caught up in this notion of objectivity, which is crucially about who is and who isn't an authorized knower. And then finally, the ideological framework are the crucial elements. Now, before I go any further, you got to remember, I'm used to working in a university where I talk for the same amount of time every day. When am I supposed to get off, John? What time is this session over? Pardon? 2 o'clock. Okay. Because we tightened up the schedule a bit, so I lost it. All right. So the ideological framework. Let's talk about the ideological framework. Well, let's actually talk about the nature of the term ideology first, real quickly. I would suggest ideology is typically used in 3 different ways in the culture. We have to be clear about what we mean by it. Sometimes we use the term ideology or ideological basically as a slur. If I'm talking to John and I think his ideas are crazy, I will say, perhaps, don't be so ideological. So instead of engaging the argument, I might try to dismiss the argument by simply implying it's ideological, which means he's fanatical, he's too rigid, he's not thinking. In John's case, it's true. It's a real problem of his, but otherwise. So we know that we sometimes, in common parlance, use the term ideological as that kind of insult. Now, in that sense, I don't think journalists are ideological. The journalists I know are not ideologues in that sense. Most of the working journalists are not. It doesn't mean there aren't some who are, but for the most part, the problem with journalists and ideology is not that they are overt, rigid, fanatical ideologues. So we have to think about what ideology means beyond that. Well, there's 2 other ways we can use it, and 2 other ways it's routinely used, I think, in social theory and politics. One is to recognize that we all have an ideology. If an ideology is defined as that sort of network of values, beliefs, assumptions about the way the world works, then everyone in this room has an ideology. We are all ideological in that sense. And I think that's, I would call that the sociological use of the term. And I think there's a way in which we can all recognize, yes, there's no kind of completely clear God's eye view of the world. We're all viewing that world from somewhere with some set of assumptions behind it. So journalists are ideological in that sense, in the same way we all are. The problem with journalism is it conceives of itself as non-ideological. Journalists say this over and over again. I always put up a slide in one of my classes, a quote from Len Downing, the former editor of the Washington Post, who says, we are non-ideological. I never seem to spend 15 weeks explaining why that's an idiotic phrase. Because, of course, journalists are ideological in that same sense. And the problem is, because journalists conceive of themselves as non-ideological, they become ideological in then the 3rd sense, which has to do with power. And for those who remember the way the term ideology is used, not only in Marxism, but in critical political and social movements more generally, ideology has a 3rd meaning. Ideology is the point of view of the dominant class, the ruling class, the owning class, depends on your nature, men in patriarchy, white people in white supremacist societies. Ideology is the process by which the dominant class takes its view of the world and makes it the view of the world, makes it the common sense of the world. So in that critical sense, ideology, if you take that view, you can say, yeah, we all have ideologies, but some ideologies are more powerful than others because those with wealth and power can make them the common sense of the culture. And that's what happens in journalism. Journalists think of themselves as non-ideological, so they are easily captured by the dominant ideology of the culture, and therefore they become a transmission vehicle for them. That's what I think happens. Now, the reason to get clear about this question of ideology and how it affects journalism is to help us understand how we are going to interact with journalism as individual activists, sometimes face-to-face with journalists, and as movements engaging with journalism at that larger level. In other words, to engage journalists and accuse them of being ideological in that first sense of the word as a slur is going to fall on deaf ears because it's not, for the most part, because it's not accurate. If you call a journalist ideological and you mean it in that insulting way, not only is it an insult, and people don't tend to respond to insults well, it's also not accurate. That's not the way journalism works, and it's not the way journalists think. If you try to suggest to journalists that they are ideological in the way we all are, and their unwillingness to recognize that can lead to them becoming this transmission vehicle for the dominant ideology, then we're in the ballpark where we can start to try to work with journalism. Now, what are those issues on which this ideology is most important? Well, I want to suggest there are, how many? Pretty good. And this one has the added bonus of being alliterative. I not only love lists of three, I love alliterative lists of three. Empire, economics, and ecology. The three most important ideological arenas to try and figure out in general, but especially in journalism. The nature of empire, economics, and ideology. Ecology. The ideology of journalism, I'm going to go really quickly because I'm really supposed to be done at 2.
We started late.
Okay. Then I can actually shut up and time. Okay. So empire. I think we all understand the ideology of empire in the United States. It's all bound up in this concept of American exceptionalism, of the notion that the United States is a break from history. Unlike other great powers, we pursue our goals in the world around freedom, democracy, the expansion thereof. That unlike the other great powers which went forward to expand itself, or to, out of greed and self-interest, to expand empires, we are a different kind of empire. And so, being clear about the nature of that ideology and the dominant culture and the way in which journalists absorb it is important. In economic terms, the dominant ideology is the naturalizing of capitalism, asserting not just that capitalism is one economic system among many that might be chosen, but at this point in history, especially after the end of the Cold War, it is the only sane and rational way to organize an economy. That's the ideology of capitalism, of economics. That it's not only a choice, perhaps for good or bad, but in fact now the only way to think about an economy. Ecologically, the ideology that's driving us is the, here I might move from ideology to insanity. The insanity of growth and the idea of endless growth on a finite planet. A very strange idea if you give it more than about 2 seconds of thought. So this notion of growth is the ideology that dominates the culture and also dominates journalism. That ideology of growth also comes with a related ideology, what some of us call technological fundamentalism. The notion that if this growth is causing problems, like the world can't sustain 7 billion people and we're running out of land and there's no clean water left and, oh, by the way, global warming is going to kill us all anyway, that when you run into those minor problems, that you have a deep-seated belief that we will always invent our way out of them. Like a sort of technological fundamentalism, which of all the fundamentalisms I think is probably the most dangerous one. And journalists, the dominant culture lives with that ideology, and journalism absorbs it as well. So, again, I'm going to be really brief and leave some time for conversation, but my point is that we have to be sometimes a little more clear and nuanced about how we understand journalism and how we engage in journalism. And the reason I say this is because I've been doing some progressive political organizing at some level or another for about 20 years, and I have consistently seen what I would call very bad strategic decisions made in the relationship activists have with journalists. That we are capable of and routinely do within these movements really bad media work. So there's two reasons I think this is important to think through. One is because if we can't think through the complexity of journalists in journalism at this level, we are going to continue to do that bad media work. Because we have, and I will acknowledge I have it too, we have a lot of anger issues, yes, about journalism. Does anyone ever watch television or read the newspaper and struggle with anger? Yes. Anger management is a very important aspect of our lives now, isn't it? Yes. Okay. So, I mean, I don't watch a lot of television anymore, partly because of my anger management issues. 7 broken televisions later. No, but we all have a kind of anger that's rooted in a sensible critique of the way journalism operates. So I'm not suggesting we should not be angry. But being able to work with journalism, because like it or not, it is the way that people learn about the world. We have to be able to separate journalists from journalism. We have to be able to think about this. We have to think about it so we can shape messages to journalists more effectively. And I have seen a tremendous amount of extremely bad media work done by very, very well-intentioned activists. And because I also still live in the media world in part, I hang out with journalists, I teach in a journalism school, a lot of my colleagues are either working or former journalists. I can tell you that they think we're a joke. And a lot of reasons they think we're a joke is because when we approach them, we are not sophisticated or sensible in the way that we approach them. Now, one reason then to care about this is to make our media work more effective. The other reason, and this is where I'll end, is because we're also at a moment where there are new opportunities in journalism. Because that business model that has for so long defined contemporary American mainstream journalism, that corporate commercial model, because it is in free fall, I'm sure you're all aware of this, the business model for the news media that I grew up in, that most of us have spent most of our life reading, is in crisis. Partly from bad decisions made by the business managers of American journalism in that consolidation process. I would argue some bad decisions about what kind of journalism to offer. But also partly because of the digital revolution and the way that that has undermined the revenue stream for a lot of contemporary news. That revenue streams that used to be solid enough to support professional journalism as we knew it are now eroding or completely evaporating. And so journalism is in a crisis. And that means, always in times of crisis, there are both, things to be very terrified of and things to try to exploit. And so journalism is remaking itself as we speak. Journalists don't know what they're doing. Certainly journalism faculty at universities don't have a clue what we're doing because we're running behind. So I think I don't have a prescription of how movements should approach this moment in journalism. It's still evolving and I tend to have great insights. But I do think that this kind of more careful analysis of journalism is important for any of us involved in any kind of progressive political organizing. For those two reasons. One, very practical in the here and now about trying to improve the media work we do. And two, staying open to new opportunities. That as the media change, not because they want to, but because they have to, that there might be openings that give us a chance to change our relationship to that very important work that journalists do. So, with that, we'll open it up to questions, comments. John, over to you.
And let's use my friend George Friday's model and take a stack of questions. And you remember your name, Lisa? 1, 2, 3 in the back, 4 down here, 5, 6. Let's start. Lisa?
Who is 6 over here, John?
Oh, okay.
Me or? No, I think it was one.
Okay. And 7 if we can get to it. We've got about 5 minutes, so we can keep questions short. We can get to more. Lisa?
I love what you said about being more professional in our work with the media. Like, they're covering a story. We've got a press release in our hand. We're fitting into their story that they're framing. But it seems to me that the whole objectivity problem is the largest in the sense of, like, there's this real narrow focus of the mainstream media, the press, and it's all that stuff outside the focus that's the real truth that's, you know, kind of suppressed. So what do you think is the best way to address that?
Sometimes you can't. Trying to improve the media work we do doesn't mean that we can ever do the media work we want to. I think sometimes we have to just accept the limitations of it. And trying to change the course of media ideologically is very, very difficult. But I think recognizing that that objectivity routine creates openings as well as problems is also important. Everybody here who's ever done local news stuff knows, for instance, that local TV news reporters are the easiest people to manipulate in the world. And it's not because they're necessarily dumb. It's because they're on incredibly tight deadlines. They need a story. They need a source. They need somebody who can talk on camera. They don't care what. You can be, you know, from Mars and they wouldn't care as long as you can do it in a 14-second soundbite. So those are the things we need to exploit in those routines. And also, in the course of doing that, build, you know, political capital with reporters. And avoid the kinds of things that immediately put you into, and I hate to use, you know, technical terms, but this is a technical term in a newsroom, nut job. That's the category you don't want to get put into, nut job. Nut job is anybody who says something to a journalist that they can't process. It doesn't fit into the world they understand it and won't make a story. And people, you know, I wish I had $1 for every time as a reporter I hung up the phone and said, what a nut job. It's just the way that you get socialized in the newsroom, and those are the things.
Second question.
I think, and I'm wondering what you think, that the thing that bothers me the most about journalism is probably not the journalist's fault at all. And that is that there's nothing comparable to the footnotes in books, that it's so hard to find out whether something that you read in the newspapers or on the news for TV is true or not.
It is difficult, and this goes to that.
Turn my hearing aids back on.
Okay. The problem, you know, journalism, like any other intellectual inquiry, and journalism is an intellectual inquiry into the nature of the world, has its own routines. Academics have, you know, these sort of rigorous developed ideas about footnotes. Journalism is different. It still has a process of verification. If you go into a newsroom, there's a lot of discussion about what is and isn't accurate. The problem is, and this is where we have to try to disrupt it, is who does and doesn't count as a source that can be credible, can be authoritative. You're right, trying to read journalism with a critical eye and figure out where did this come from, who is this, because it all's kind of jumbled in that mix, is a problem. But what we have to do in a very practical sense is simply get into that category of authorized knowers, of credible sources. And then we do get in the mix. We're never going to dominate that mix, but we can get in that mix. Meanwhile, readers are forced to sort it all out, and it's very difficult for the reason you said.
Third question.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can touch on a little bit of the element of the internet news possibilities, extracting ourselves away from the corporate fix. Maybe are there any recent developments, or I know there are different ways we can get our news independently, but as far as journalism is concerned, getting journalists on a more independent basis out and getting news that's not so purchased by the corporate world.
I mean, I don't have anything to say that isn't kind of obvious, but you know, it's a blessing and a curse. The internet dramatically expands our capacity to reach others, and as individuals, our capacity to learn about the world. The most obvious benefit is being able to read newspapers from other parts of the world, which used to be an expensive enterprise, now is literally a button away. And it's a huge improvement in our potential news diet. On the other hand, as someone who came up through professional journalism, and despite my critique of it, does admire the notion of verification. The internet is a disaster because so many of these websites have no process of verification. And I think our job is to try, as people who are often leading others to information sources, I bet everybody in this room is one of those folks who helps others find things on the internet. That what we have to do is be a little more careful about not forwarding everything, because there's a lot of crap on the internet, including a lot of crap that validates our point of view. And that's a skill to develop. And the only way to do that is to do it collectively. I mean, sharing is really important. What we want from journalism in the end is not that they just agree with us. If I read only journalism that agreed with me, it would be a disaster. What we want is journalism that is truly independent. Independent not only from government, but independent from other forces, such as corporate forces or the ideological forces. So there's no way to do that in this mess of the internet without a fair amount of work, and that has to be shared collectively, or else we'll all drown, which many people feel like they are doing.
Fourth question.
I apologize, and I may have missed it, but how do you define war media?
Well, that was the title given. I don't remember where it came from or what it means, so I have no idea. But I think what we're getting at is the fact that certainly within the last decade, but traditionally, when the United States has gone to war, let's just confine it to the post-World War II era. When the United States has gone to war, the journalism of the mainstream has capitulated and essentially become a war medium. But if you think about what journalism is for in a culture, it's to provide an independent critical examination of power.
Yes.
That's what journalists claim to be doing. The watchdog function. There's a lot of different terms to use this. The sad thing is that at the time we need journalism the most, when a nation state is contemplating war or going to war, the time when the power of, especially the largest and most powerful nation state in the history of the world, the United States, that the time we need a critical independent journalism the most is exactly the time when we have not gotten it. And so war media, at least to me, implies that journalism is never a perfect enterprise. It does that job of providing a critical independent watchdog function, better or worse in certain times and places. But the time it consistently fails is during war. And that includes, by the way, the Vietnam War. Some of you are old enough to remember this. But this myth that somehow American journalism was this, this pit bull that helped bring down the Johnson administration and then the Vietnam War is a total fantasy. Especially at the beginning of the Vietnam War, there's a lot of research to document this. The media was performing its ideological function in the other sense of endorsing that war. So war media simply means that journalism performs, better or worse, but it's almost always failing in the post-World War era, especially in its task of holding power accountable during the war, and more importantly, the run-up to war, when that skepticism is most important.
Fifth question. Who's number 5?
Bingo! Oh. Yeah.
5 was down here.
Who's number 5?
I don't know. I was 6, but I'll be 5.
6, now we're on to 6.
We've got two more. Donna and the gentleman behind you.
Okay. All right.
Go ahead.
Okay, we're at number 6, I think.
Okay. All right. Well, mine's kind of a dual question. What do you think of what's now called citizen journalism? What are the possibilities for it? And what are the basic criteria? Here you can use your list of 3 if you want. Basic criteria or elements for an effective media campaign.
Citizen journalism is one of those terms that means different things in different places.
Okay.
To some news managers, trying to minimize their labor costs. Citizen journalism means get people to do stuff for free so you can fire reporters. That's not a good kind of citizen journalism. You go to a lot of local papers, and they're thinking, yeah, citizen journalism, let's outsource. If citizen journalism means people thinking critically, recognizing the limitations of professional journalism, and producing accounts of the world that offer a different perspective, then that's a good thing. I think if citizen journalism were defined in that latter sense, and there were mechanisms for funding it, in the same way that at least sometimes in places we fund art and other intellectual and creative enterprises, then citizen journalism could be a great boon. But if it becomes just one more way to, aggregate data about soccer leagues and, things like that, then, it's not a particularly positive. And because John is looking over my shoulder, I'm not going to go into what makes an effective media campaign. I think there's, whole books and workshops and things on that. And I'd be happy to talk more about it when John isn't threatening me.
Last question, gentlemen.
See, 40 years ago, we had more, it seemed like we had more open press during the Vietnam War, that you would see the body bags and the reporting at night and actually the fighting. And now we don't see anything. No bodies. They just recently allowed the press to show the caskets. So what happened? That's my first question. Why do we go from being more open to being more closed?
And that's the last question.
Okay.
I think the first thing to remember is that journalism is not an autonomous entity floating outside of the culture. Journalism, like a lot of things, and university teaching is the same way. Journalism opens up and closes down in part depending on the culture. So university teaching in the 1950s was this locked down, ideologically controlled place, McCarthyism, people getting fired. In the 1960s, it opened up, and there was this space within universities then for critique. Didn't mean every professor was critiquing. All right, so you got to remember that these entities, these institutions like journalism teaching, are reflecting what's going on in the culture. Also remember that the people in power, just as we learn new tactics, new strategies, they're learning too. And the most obvious story, and I'll tell this very quickly, Vietnam, from the World War II experience and the gung-ho support of journalism, the army, the military had no systematic way to control journalists. And as a result, when the war really started to break down, some of this critical reporting started seeping in. Not the dominant trend, but it did. And the military looked at that and said, that's bad. We can't let these folks run around in the field without control. So fast forward to the Gulf War in 1991. A very rigid censorship, press pools, military minders. The press was shut down completely. The problem with that was that the military looked and said, well, we're shutting these people down, but they're not then telling those good patriotic stories that we got so much mileage out of in World War II. So the Iraq War pioneered then a new tactic, which was give the journalists all the access they want. Send it, give them everything. Go ahead. And with some, and it turned out to be a very intelligent decision, with some expectation that they're going to mostly tell the stories you want them to tell. And that's why the Iraq War, the most televised war in history, was produced with the cooperation of the military. Because they knew, especially with the TV people, you put these folks in with the troops, and you're going to get more of those World War II patriotic stories about the glory of American fighting men and women. And so these things go in cycles. They learn, we learn, the press reflects the dominant culture, and out of that you can start to see the patterns that you're talking about. That's I think the best way to understand it. There's nothing magical that happens. It's simply that very complex process. So let me take 4 or 5 more questions.